I'm Nick Terse. I'm a freelance investigative journalist and a war reporter specializing in national security and military issues in Africa. Our story is about the secret deployment of U.S. commandos on the African continent. Our investigation found that the reach of America's most elite military forces is far larger than anyone knew before. In 2019 alone, U.S. commandos were deployed in 22 African countries. I first came across this story while investigating U.S. military bases on the continent. I thought it was important because people across Africa have a right and a need to know what's happening in their own countries. Often, we report these stories in U.S. media outlets, but that isn't always the audience that needs to know. Secret U.S. military activities can have devastating consequences, but people can only hold their governments accountable if they have accurate information. I thought it was important that this information be made available to an African audience because that's where these activities were taking place. So I reached out to the Mail and Guardian.
My name is Simon Allison. I am the Africa editor for the Mail and Guardian newspaper in South Africa. We are a weekly based in Johannesburg with a Pan-African footprint. When Nick first came to us with this story, we knew immediately that it was a big one. The sheer numbers of countries that US Special Forces were operating in blew us away. We had no idea. And we thought it was a really important story to tell for our audience, which are people in the countries where these US commandos were operating in secret. Now, Nick had put together all the numbers, where these were happening, and a little bit about what was going on, but we really wanted to put more flesh on the bones of the story, to get some really good details on what exactly these US Special Forces were doing in the countries involved. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem. We would get Nick on a plane, send him to Nigeria or Burkina Faso or Somalia, some of the countries that were mentioned, and get him to do some reporting. But this was in the middle of a pandemic and borders were closed. We could not operate as we would normally do, so we had to think a little bit differently. And instead of getting Nick to do all the reporting, we found journalists already in the countries we were interested in who had existing networks and contacts and brought them into the project to try and give it that original feel.
Hi, I'm Sam Mednick. I'm a freelance journalist based in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. It's easy enough to see special operations people here because there's a big enough operation, but it's harder to really figure out what they're doing. Although I did discover early on that they seem to really like carrot cake, and so I used those breadcrumbs to help me start my investigation. The way I went about digging was to speak to people who had been in the country for many years and to ask them to connect me to special operations people who had been in the country when they were here. And that really helped kickstart my findings. The other thing I did was I was able to travel around to the different regions and speak to Burkinabe security forces, the gendarme, the police, the army, and ask them who gave them training and what the training was like. And most of them were fairly open with me.
For this story, we also worked with Amanda Spower, who's based in Nairobi, but who has worked extensively in Somalia on US counterterrorism issues and drone strikes. And Joel Kanopo contributed reporting from Botswana. So it really was a continental effort. And you know what? I think that the end result was much stronger as a result because we had a team, a core team of 4 journalists working on this, contributing their expertise, their sourcing, their knowledge of the situation. And that allowed us to cover a lot more ground than we would have otherwise.